In part one of this series, we followed the Celts and the Germans from their Yamnaya roots to the tribes, kingdoms, and nations that we all know today. And in this video, we are going to be turning to the rest of Europe. From the Balto-Slavs who stayed close to the mainland, to the Balkan tribes who rose and fell in prominence, the Greeks who forged Western civilization, and the Italians who gave us Rome and the Romance languages. It is a tangled web, but by breaking it down step by step like we did in part one, we can come to find a simpler, more cohesive understanding of how these migrations panned out and who these people are today. So without further ado, let's go back to 3300 BC to the Pontic-Caspian steppe. So before any of these modern nations or tribes even exist, we have the Proto-Indo-European peoples who began migrating out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe area in what we understand as the Yamnaya horizon, the first archaeological culture that is identifiable of the Proto-Indo-European people. They were located in the area of what is modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, and they were nomadic pastoralists who herded cattle, sheep, and other livestock. They're also attributed with having invented the wheel and domesticated the horse. And when you put those two things together, you develop quite the formidable force multiplier when it comes to conquering new territories. Genetically, they are a mix of about 50% Eastern hunter-gatherer and 50% Caucasus hunter-gatherer. And when you blend those two together, you have the sort of steppe derived ancestry that we'll probably be referring to throughout the rest of the video. Most importantly, the language that they are speaking is referred to as Proto-Indo-European. That's where we get the name for these people. It is the root of almost every major language family across Europe and much of Asia. And while these people were expanding and conquering on horseback and in wheeled chariots, they were also bringing their customs and hierarchies and their language with them. By about 2500 BC, they begin pushing outward in all directions, and this is where our story really begins. By about 2500 BC, the Yamnaya peoples started migrating into new territories and intermixing with the local Neolithic farmer populations that they encountered. This blend is incredibly important because you sort of have the stability and structure from the farming populations with the patriarchal, sort of like war-minded culture of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. And this makes for a pretty solid equation when it comes to developing civilization. Up north, the Balto-Slavs are essentially the ones who stayed put. They occupied the broad forest steppe zone of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. They live along the rivers that feed into the Baltic and Black Seas. Their language seems to stay the closest to what original Proto-Indo-European would have sounded like, and this is likely due to their limited interaction with other cultures. And their lifestyles probably wouldn't have changed very much either, as they were still heavily pastoral, not farming very much, and just remaining close to the land that they knew well. Down south in the Balkans, however, new Indo-European arrivals filter into modern Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, Croatia, and Serbia, mingling with the ancient farmers who have lived there since 6000 BC. Here the roots of the Thracians, Illyrians, and Dacians begin to form as they live in small fortified settlements, farming valleys, and guarding mountain passes that will later become some of the most contested terrain in all of Europe. Some of these Indo-European migrants, however, decided to move even further south into mainland Greece, and these would become the Proto-Hellenes, the earliest ancestors of the Greeks. They're mixing with Aegean farming communities and absorbing influences from Crete and even the Levant, producing a population that is roughly half steppe herder and half Aegean farmer, and you seem to lose more of the steppe ancestry the further that you move south. We will see this in future videos as well. They are not yet building palaces or doing philosophy, writing poetry, that sort of thing, but they are establishing the foundations of what will later become one of the greatest civilizations in Western history. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, today's Austria, Switzerland, and southern Germany, the Proto-Italo-Celtic group takes shape. They're still a single cultural community at this stage. They are not yet divided into the separate Italic and Celtic tribes. However, in the future, these would be the people that would eventually give rise to the Roman Empire and the Celts, but for now, they remain as a united people. So by about 2000 BC, all of the major migrations have already taken place, and people are now starting to solidify into their distinct cultures and identities. The pieces are all in place, the migrations are sort of settled for now, and this would carry us into around 1600 BC, the beginning of the Bronze Age. So by about 1600 BC, bronze is transforming the entire world. Across Europe and the Near East, chariots, weapons, and armor are all being made from this new alloy, and they are completely reshaping power dynamics throughout all of the known world. This is also sort of the dawn of true civilization. This is where many of the mythic stories that we know from the past come from, because we start to see the beginning of writing, especially in these areas. Up north, the Balto-Slavs are remaining relatively quiet in the forest steppe zones of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. They live much as their ancestors did, herding. They're now beginning to farm, and they are still preserving a language that is very close to Proto-Indo-European. What's cool is that their linguistic and genetic continuity kind of makes them like a nice anchor population for us to be able to refer back to the people who are genetically, maybe even linguistically, the most similar to the original Proto-Indo-Europeans. I don't know, maybe that kind of personally just makes a lot of sense to me. Further south, the tribal landscape in the Balkans begins to solidify into distinct groups. In the east, the Thracians occupy what is now Bulgaria and Romania, famed for their gold and their warrior kings, as mentioned centuries later in Homer's Iliad. To the west, in the mountains of Albania, Montenegro, and Croatia, the Illyrians emerge. These are seafarers and traders who are guarding the Adriatic routes and, of course, committing acts of piracy, because you can't really have a seafaring population without pirates. That's kind of just par for the course. North of the Danube, the Dacians are consolidating power in the Carpathian Mountains, building fortified hilltop strongholds that will make them notorious to later empires. Meanwhile, in mainland Greece, the Indo-European settlers who arrived centuries earlier are now evolving into the Mycenaeans, the first civilizations that we can truly call Greek. Around 1600 BC, they begin constructing palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns, each one ruling its own territory of farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers. They're conducting trade across the Aegean, places like Crete, Anatolia, and even Egypt, and bringing in things like ivory and gold and other luxurious goods. What's also noteworthy of the Mycenaeans is their invention of written language, as I mentioned earlier. Their scribes record inventories in Linear B, the earliest known form of written Greek. And this is vastly important because this is the world behind Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. This is Bronze Age Greece that we mythologize and romanticize so much, and the only reason that we're really able to do so somewhat accurately is because we have written records. We also have Homer, but that's later. But around 1200 BC, it all collapses. The Mycenaean palaces burn, trade networks crumble, and the entire eastern Mediterranean falls into chaos from Greece to Anatolia, all the way down to Egypt. Whether it was caused by invasions from the sea peoples or drought or famine, we aren't really sure, but historians are certain that there was a cataclysmic event of some kind that brought about the fall of the Bronze Age, the Bronze Age collapse. From this point on, Greece enters what historians refer to as a dark age for centuries to come. Also, though, across the Adriatic, the Proto-Italic peoples are now finally on the move, having split from their Celtic cousins in Central Europe, and they are now migrating south into the Italian peninsula. By 1100 BC, they settled in Latium and central Italy, blending with the older Neolithic populations and interacting with the mysterious Etruscans. They're still building for now, but what is important is that these would be the people that would later be the founders of the Roman Empire, which I don't need to explain how vastly important that is. But with the collapse of the Bronze Age comes a new era, one forged by a brand new alloy. So by 1100 BC, the entire Bronze Age world has completely collapsed, but a new one is rising in its ashes, one forged from iron. And iron is an alloy like bronze, however, it is cheaper, it is stronger, and it's more abundant than bronze. It kind of makes you wonder why they were using bronze in the first place, but that's beyond my scope of knowledge. Down south in the Balkans, the Thracians are now occupying the eastern mountains and plains of Bulgaria, Romania, and European Turkey as fierce warriors, horsemen, and goldsmiths. To the west, the Illyrians still control the rugged Adriatic coast of Albania, Montenegro, and Croatia, where they have now built fortresses in the highlands and continue to dominate maritime trade and, yes, sometimes still commit acts of piracy. North of the Danube in Transylvania, the Dacians rise as a formidable power, building hilltop strongholds and guarding the crossroads between Central Europe and the Balkans, which is obviously an incredibly important trade route. Meanwhile, down south in Greece, the Dark Ages after the fall of the Mycenaeans finally fades into the background, and within 100 years, from about 900 BC to 800 BC, small villages are able to transform into thriving city-states. The Greek alphabet is adopted, and the memory of the Bronze Age is brought into epic form through Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and by the 8th and 7th centuries, Greek ships are once again sailing the Aegean and Mediterranean, founding colonies in Asia Minor, southern Italy, and Sicily. And by the end of the Iron Age, trade, art, politics, philosophy are all beginning to flourish in Greek city-states like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. They are all independent, but they are all uniquely Greek. They share the same gods, languages, and history. Up north, a new civilization begins to emerge, the Macedonians. They are a tough frontier kingdom that shares Greek ancestry and culture, but they are slightly different, and they are considered by the Greeks to be barbarians because of their more rugged, rustic lifestyle. The Macedonians are still sort of developing during this time, but they will be a pivotal player to come very shortly, as they will be the first to unite Greece for the first time in history. Finally, across the Adriatic, the Italic tribes are now settling into their own, and by 900 BC, the Latins have established themselves in central Italy, surrounded by other Italic tribes like the Umbrians, the Oscans, the Sabines, and Samnites, all descended from the Proto-Italic migrants of the Bronze Age. By the 8th century BC, Greek colonies are starting to crop up along the Italian coastline. And then in 753 BC, a new city is founded in the heart of Latium, Rome. At first, it is just another Latin settlement, but it is quickly evolving into something very formidable, and by 509, it overthrows its last king and becomes the world's first republic, a new political experiment that will one day dominate the entire Mediterranean. The next 1,000 years that we're about to dive into, from 500 BC to 500 AD, in this particular area of the world, you could not make a video long enough to fit all of the information necessary. We're going to do our best. Please bear with me. I'm going to have to skip so many things. I'm trying to keep this to the bare minimum so that you can understand how these modern nation states have evolved and formed. So we'll begin with Greece. By 500 BC, Greece is exploding with activity. This is the birth of philosophy. This is the birth of democracy, of Spartan military dominance, and the Persian Wars. All of these things that are so distinctly classically Greek, right? We have war heroes like Leonidas and Themistocles. You have philosophical heroes like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. This is when Greek culture defines what the rest of Western civilization is going to look like. At the same time, the Balkan forces, the Thracians, Illyrians, Dacians, are now starting to press on Greece's northern borders, and as we know, we got Macedonians over there now. In 359 BC, the Illyrian king Bardalus kills the Macedonian king in battle. But when Philip II takes the throne a year later, he is able to defeat Bardalus, and he breaks Illyrian dominance, and they would not recover very well or very quickly from this. Under Macedon, Greece would unite for the first time in its history, but this would be very brief, as his son, Alexander the Great, would come into prominence and then begin to spread Greek and Macedonian culture all over his known world. Between 334 and 323 BC, Alexander launches one of the most astonishing campaigns in all of history. In just over a decade, he conquers Asia Minor, Egypt, Persia, and pushes as far as the Indus Valley, building a short-lived empire that stretches from Greece all the way to India. Wherever he goes, Greek language, art, and learning take root, laying the foundation for a new cosmopolitan age. After Alexander's death, however, in 323 BC, his empire fractures, as many great empires do after their great leader dies. After this point, his generals carve up the world, but Greek culture spreads everywhere, from Egypt to India. The Ptolemies rule Egypt, the Seleucids take Asia, and for the next 2 centuries, Greek ideas would dominate all 3 continents of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Meanwhile, the Balkans are remaining fiercely independent, and the Illyrians are still pirating the Adriatic Sea, which is now starting to draw Rome, a rising power, into its first wars east of Italy. The Illyrian Wars from 229 to 168 BC mark the beginning of Rome's expansion across the Adriatic and into the east. The Thracians fight as mercenaries for both Greeks and Romans, while Dacians continue to grow stronger north of the Danube, which is a reminder that beyond Rome's borders, new powers are indeed starting to form, as we saw in part 1. Fast forward to 146 BC, and Greece is now fully absorbed into the Roman Republic. Rome now looks east and begins a slow push through the Balkans, dismantling Illyrian power, turning Thracian kingdoms into client states, and watching the rise of Dacia, now unified under King Burebista. And by the 1st century BC, Dacia is powerful enough to threaten Rome's new provinces. By the late Republic era, Rome has entirely outgrown Italy, and it is now starting to become the dominant force throughout the entire Mediterranean. Centuries of relentless warfare have turned this small city-state into a vast empire that controls much of the Mediterranean. The Punic Wars against Carthage bring control of Sicily, Spain, and North Africa. In the north, Julius Caesar conquers Gaul in 50 BC, bringing what is now France and Belgium into Rome's orbit and pushing its frontier all the way to the English Channel. In the east, Pompey campaigns through Anatolia, Syria, and Judea, bringing the wealth of the Hellenistic kingdoms from Alexander's time under Roman control. By the 1st century BC, Rome's legions have brought the entire known world from the Atlantic coast to the Euphrates River under Roman control. This is obviously one of the most pivotal transitions in history. However, the Republic's endless expansion has left it completely exhausted, ultra wealthy, and very unstable, which just so happens to be the perfect condition for one single person to come in and take control. Following the path carved out for him by his adoptive father Julius Caesar, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, rises to power. Following in the wake of Augustus, the Roman Empire for the next couple hundred years would continue to consolidate power and expand its borders. Egypt is annexed, Britain is conquered under Claudius in 43 AD, and under Trajan, Rome reaches its greatest extent from the Atlantic to the Caspian, from the Sahara Desert all the way up to the Scottish Highlands. And over time, it divides up because nothing that large can ever possibly be sustained under one ruler. So now you have the Latin West and the Greek East, and these would remain 2 halves that are relatively separate entities that call themselves Rome. The Illyrians are partly absorbed into the empire, though some mountain tribes remain stubbornly independent and may be the direct descendants of modern-day Albanians today. We might get into that in a second. The Thracians are also gradually Romanized, and they fade as a distinct people, while the Dacians fight their great showdown with Rome under Emperor Trajan, and Rome of course wins. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the Balkan tribes are starting to kind of rise to prominence again under Roman rule. You have emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian, and even Constantine the Great all came from Balkan tribes. I think they may have actually all been Illyrian as well. In the east, the old Greek world transforms into the Byzantine Empire, ruled from Constantinople, which was a city founded by Constantine the Great in 330 AD on the site of ancient Byzantium. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire completely collapses at the hands of the Germanic peoples that we referenced in part 1. By this point, Latin has already splintered into the various Romance languages, or at least the sort of proto-languages that would emerge later on. Greece is now Byzantium, and the Balkans stand on the brink of a new migration that would bring Slavic influence. Yes, we're talking about the Balto-Slavs again. I know we haven't mentioned them in a while. They haven't really been doing much. They've been kind of hanging out in the same place they've always been. But don't you worry, they will make their way into this story. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, we're able to turn our attention almost entirely to the east, Byzantium. From its capital in Constantinople, it fights off Persian invasions, survives the first wave of Arab expansion, and becomes the Christian powerhouse of the medieval East, which will become very important for the kingdoms that would later come in this area that we're talking about. Around the same time period, from 500 to 700 AD, the Slavs surge outward from their northern homeland, creating the East Slavs in Russia and Ukraine, the West Slavs into Poland and Bohemia, and South Slavs are pouring into the Balkans, reshaping its ethnic map forever. In Italy, the Latin dialects keep evolving, and people are no longer speaking classical Latin. They are now speaking vulgar Latin, which later hardens into the other various Romance languages I mentioned. Politically, the peninsula is completely fragmented. You have the Germanic Lombards ruling the north, the Byzantines in the south, and this is when we see the rise of the papacy in Rome, as we have the Great Schism in 1054 AD between the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Catholic Church. What does religion have to do with this? Everything from now on. In the Greek world, Byzantium thrives, and Constantinople is the capital of a Christian empire that still calls itself Rome, but culturally is still very Greek. They still speak Greek, they are Greek, they're Greek. Now in the Balkans, new Slavic kingdoms are starting to emerge in Serbia, Croatia, and Bulgaria, layered over the old Illyrian and Thracian lands. Now that these countries in the Balkans have become almost entirely Slavic and they are now speaking Slavic languages, we kind of start to see a pattern develop that we saw thousands of years ago. You'll notice that the people with primarily steppe-derived ancestry are capable of coming in and influencing their culture and language, most importantly. So the rule becomes whoever has the most Proto-Indo-European steppe-derived ancestry, that's what language you're going to speak from now on. There are, however, a couple of exceptions to this rule, the Basque people of northern Spain and southwestern France being one of them, the Albanians being another. And this is one of the reasons that some historians think that the Albanians may be, like, genetically direct descendants of the ancient Illyrians, because they speak a language that is unlike any other Slavic language. It's actually not even a Slavic language. It's more of an ancient language. It's its own offshoot of Proto-Indo-European. This is why people believe that they were the Illyrians that hung out in the mountains for thousands of years when everything else was going on. I have no dog in this fight, I just think it's interesting. Over the next few centuries, missionaries from Byzantium like Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius would bring Christianity and the Slavic alphabet to these new kingdoms. Bulgaria and later the Kievan Rus adopt the Orthodox faith, tying the Slavic world permanently to Greek culture and religion. Finally, by the year 1000 AD, the map of Europe looks much closer to the one that we recognize today. Italy is now a patchwork of Romance-speaking languages, and they are still under heavy Germanic rule in the west, like we laid out in part 1, and heavy Byzantine rule in the east. But linguistically, Italy is still rooted in Latin. The Slavs are now fully established through Eastern and Central Europe, and their language begins to fragment into Eastern, Western, and Southern dialects. And finally, that leaves us with Byzantium, which used to be Greece. Under Emperor Basil II, Byzantium reaches its final golden age, reclaiming lands across the Balkans and standing as the greatest power in Eastern Europe. But by the late 11th century, the empire faces new threats from Western Catholic crusaders and Norman invaders, as well as the rising power of the Ottoman Turks in the east. All signs that the balance of the medieval world was about to shift all over again. By 1200 AD, all of the old tribes have now essentially become kingdoms and nations. The Franks are now France, the Anglo-Saxons are now England, we have the Holy Roman Empire, so what's going on in Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe? By 1200 AD, the Slavs are now fully established. You have the Polish and the Bohemians in the west, the Serbians and the Bulgarians in the south, and the Russians are beginning to grow in the east. The Greeks continue to endure as Byzantium, the last living fragment of what was once Rome. They're still very much Greek linguistically and culturally, but their ancient flame is slowly being extinguished from pressures from the Catholic West and the Islamic East. Crusaders sack Constantinople in 1204 AD, and by 1453, the Ottomans take the city, ending 1,000 years of Roman rule in the east. And finally, to the far north, the Balts start to slowly emerge from obscurity. I was not leaving them out of the story on purpose. There was just not a lot of activity going on in the Baltic regions, but now they are starting to finally come into play. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania rises to power, creating a vast realm stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, but they would be the only Baltic people to build a medieval empire. The others were not so fortunate. The Old Prussians and the Latvians fall under the rule of German crusaders rather immediately. Fast forward to 1500 AD, and the Renaissance in Europe is creating a revival of classic Roman and Greek literature, art, philosophy, all these things. Latin now remains the language of scholars and artists, even though its descendants, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, are now starting to spread out throughout the entire world. In the east, Russia rises as the Orthodox heir to Byzantium, the so-called Third Rome. Across the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire dominates, yet Byzantine faith and culture endure underground through the Orthodox Church. And in the north, the Balts fade again from prominence as Lithuania is drawn into a long union with Poland, and the once pagan Baltic coast becomes Catholic and Lutheran. By the dawn of the modern age, Europe's great migrations are over, and the people are relatively staying put. By the beginning of the 19th century, however, something very interesting happens. The descendants of the Proto-Indo-European peoples, the peoples of Europe, are now looking backwards to try and find some semblance of their roots, their ancient connectivity. And this is what historians refer to as the Age of Nationalism. This idea of nationalism was born from the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the Romantic movement that caused people to sort of search for a deeper meaning. And language, folklore, and myth once again became sacred. They became tools for rediscovering who these people truly are, very reminiscent of what we are doing right now. From this Age of Nationalism, we see the map begin to shift once again very recently. The Greeks rise from Ottoman rule in the 1820s, reclaiming their place among the nations with a strong Christian identity. Italy unifies around its Latin heritage, and the Slavs awaken. Serbia, Bulgaria, Poland, and others fighting for independence, while Russia claims the role of the protector of the Slavic world. Even the Balts begin to stir again under the empires that ruled them, laying the groundwork for the national revivals that would come a century later. Fast forward to the 20th century, and every single nation in Europe speaks a Proto-Indo-European language. They all are of Proto-Indo-European descent to some extent or another, and we can finally understand this all-encompassing, vastly complicated story of how Europe became what it is today. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I hope that it was relatively easy to follow along. I know that we covered like an ungodly amount of information. However, I do plan on making a third part to this where we are going to cover the Proto-Indo-European migrations into the Indo direction. We're going to go to the east. We're going to cover much of Russia that we didn't talk about, India, and the Near East, and explain how those migrations occurred and the lasting impact that they have had to this day. If you guys enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're new, share this video with someone who you think would absolutely love it, and please let me know in the comments what you guys think. The channel is still relatively small. We're growing. I'm still figuring out what I'm going to do here. So any input is greatly appreciated. God bless you guys, and I will see you next time.